Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're jumping right into a truly fascinating geopolitical shift, the silent, almost invisible collapse of Russian influence in the South Caucasus. For roughly 2 centuries, Russia held this region in an incredibly tight grip. But lately, the foundation of that power has just quietly crumbled, and honestly, the wider world has barely noticed. We're going to pop the hood and look closely at what that grip actually consisted of mechanically and what exactly replaced it. Now, as always, this explainer doesn't take a side on the merits of anyone's conduct. We're just here to look at the structural facts of how power in a region completely transforms. So, let's dive into this. How exactly do you tell when a great power has lost a region? The reality is, empires don't usually announce their retreat. It's not like they issue a press release saying, "Hey everyone, our influence is gone." Instead, you have to measure that retreat by a much quieter indicator. What a smaller neighbor suddenly feels completely free to do without facing any consequences. And to really understand this, we need to look at one specific, incredibly revealing event that serves as the match in the powder barrel. Picture this: August 20th, 2026. Azerbaijan's foreign ministry formally summons the Russian ambassador. They hand over a formal protest about what Baku called provocative, offensive statements and threats against their leadership in the Russian media. Now, if you read that in isolation, summoning an ambassador is, a pretty routine diplomatic move. But read against the history of this specific region, it's staggering. Literally just 6 years ago, this kind of public defiance, this absolute lack of fear from Baku toward Moscow, would have been totally inconceivable. So what changed?
Well, to answer that, we have to deconstruct power mechanically. Influence isn't just some abstract vibe. Historically, Moscow's grip on the South Caucasus rested on 3 very practical pillars. First up, the security guarantee. Russia was the ultimate referee, the power that could shut down a war or let one run wild. Second, transit and trade routes. Landlocked economies had to move their stuff north through Russian territory, meaning they always needed Moscow's permission. And third, energy routing. The pipelines and power grids that literally keep a modern state's lights on were all tied back to Russia. You knock out any one of those and influence weakens, knock out all 3, the smaller state stops asking for permission and starts summoning ambassadors.
Okay, so how did Baku actually start testing these pillars? The rupture begins with a tragedy. Christmas Day, 2024, Azerbaijan Airlines Flight 8243 crashes near Aktau in Kazakhstan. 67 people were on board, 38 of them tragically died. Preliminary reports pointed to the plane being struck by shrapnel from a Russian air defense system. And just 3 days later, President Vladimir Putin actually apologized, acknowledging it happened in Russian airspace. But look at the timeline here. It took 16 grueling months, including a whole presidential meeting in Dushanbe in October 2025, just to reach a settlement by April 2026.
But you know what's absolutely crucial for our story? It's what happened during that 16-month interval. Baku learned something it hadn't really had the chance to test before. They figured out that they could press Moscow publicly. They could flat out refuse to let the matter be swept under the rug. And they realized they could probably absorb whatever retaliation Moscow threw at them. But here's the real kicker. Nothing came back. Moscow didn't retaliate. Baku pushed, and that expected pushback, it just never arrived.
Let's look at how this builds, because it gets intense. The real escalation, the moment Baku really turned the dial all the way up, started with a policing incident. Reports describe Russian special forces killing 2 ethnic Azerbaijanis in Yekaterinburg, followed by some really harsh arrests and allegations of torture. This time, Baku didn't just send a polite diplomatic note. They took massive, unprecedented action. When you look at this visual ledger of the conflict, the contrast is kind of mind-blowing. The Moscow side of the ledger is just starkly, uncomfortably empty.
Just look at the specific steps Baku took. They canceled all planned state-level contacts with Russia. They actually arrested a group of Russian citizens, including editors from the Russian state-owned media outlet Sputnik. They even canceled concerts featuring Russian performers. Think about the strategic calculation there. A state that expects to get hammered in retaliation does not arrest the state media editors of its giant neighbor. Baku did the math and calculated that Moscow's tools for retaliation were either unavailable or just way too costly to use because they were distracted elsewhere. That's a huge gamble on relative power, and Baku hit the nail right on the head.
Now let's pivot to how this whole new reality targets that second pillar we talked about, transit. Landlocked trade has to go somewhere, right? Historically, the route from China to Europe went straight north through Russia. But since 2022, they've been seriously building out a new path, the Middle Corridor. This thing goes across Central Asia, over the Caspian Sea, through Azerbaijan and Turkey, and straight into Europe. It completely 100% bypasses Russian territory. And Azerbaijan isn't just watching this happen. They are the western hinge of this entire operation. Every single shipping container rolling down this corridor turns their geography into massive revenue and some very real geopolitical leverage.
And sitting right in the sweet spot of this new transit architecture is the Zangezur corridor. It's a link across southern Armenia that connects Azerbaijan to its Nakhchivan exclave. Now, here is where you literally see Moscow getting erased. Back in 2020, an agreement explicitly promised a Russian security role over this exact corridor. But then, a later bilateral decision just quietly deferred the whole question. They effectively wiped any future Russian presence right off the map. It is the perfect illustration of this shift. Russia was written into the region's most important new infrastructure, and then, poof, they were quietly written right back out.
Which brings a very heavy hitter into the mix. Disclosed in January 2026, the TRIP implementation framework is a massive, US-backed infrastructure deal. This isn't just talk. It's a framework for building and operating railways, roads, power grids, and digital networks all along these new routes. What we're watching in real time is the deliberate displacement of military reliance. It's being swapped out for deep, structural, commercial power. I want you to just let this number sink in for a second. 49. Under the TRIP framework, revenue generation and collection are locked in for a minimum of 49 years. A 49-year concession isn't some quick trade deal. It literally means whoever holds this agreement is committing to the stability of the South Caucasus for half a century. Building infrastructure on this scale turns the region into a permanent, long-term interest for outside powers. It cements the exit of Russian influence.
So the strategic logic here is absolutely brilliant. Reporting notes the American goal of limiting Russian and Iranian influence in the region, but notice how they're doing it. Not with military bases, not with defense pacts. They are using a commercial instrument. They're displacing Moscow's influence not by fighting a war over it, but by making it completely irrelevant. Because if Moscow's main leverage was controlling the transit routes, the most devastating answer to a route is just building another route.
But hey, we have to be realistic. This isn't playing out the exact same way everywhere. We really need to look at Georgia as the counterweight to Baku's story. While Azerbaijan is strutting out of Russian influence with a ton of confidence, thanks to their oil, gas, and prime geography, Georgia is trapped in a fiercely contested struggle. It's proof that just because you're escaping an empire's orbit doesn't mean you get instant stability. The transition can be incredibly, brutally chaotic.
Just look at the massive infrastructure failures that hit Georgia in August 2026. We are talking about their third major power outage in just 2 weeks. Power went down in literally every single city. The metro in Tbilisi, completely suspended. This is that final energy pillar failing in real time, plunging a country into literal darkness. And yet, right in the middle of that third blackout, supporters of European integration were still out there protesting outside Parliament, marking day 616 of non-stop protests. A failing grid is a harsh reminder that ditching one geopolitical order doesn't instantly build a new one. But people protesting in the dark? That tells you the old assumption that Moscow dictates the future is totally dead.
Okay, so what's the big takeaway for us here? If you want to know if this geopolitical shift is actually permanent, tune out the diplomatic speeches. You need to watch these 3 tangible metrics. First, middle corridor freight volumes. A transit route only gives you leverage if stuff is actually moving on it. Talk is cheap, but shipping containers are not. Second, keep an eye on Moscow's material response. They still have weapons like energy pricing and diaspora labor. If they don't use them, it means their restraint is structural, not just a choice. And third, watch who actually ends up operating that Zangezur corridor. Concrete and steel settle political questions that diplomats can argue over for decades.
Which brings us right back to our original question. How do you tell when a great power has lost a region? Now, there's definitely a version of this story where this is all just a temporary blip, something Russia could reverse if they ever get less bogged down elsewhere. But there's another version. A version where a smaller state realized the invisible chains holding it down were completely rusted through, and all they had to do was give them a yank. Look, nobody marks a calendar on the exact day an empire's retreat becomes permanent. But that August 20th summons in Baku, it proves one very profound reality. Standing up to Moscow right now costs absolutely nothing. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope it gave you a fresh lens to look at this changing world. Keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.